Good week for investors in the stock market as the market rebounds after a small market correction that has been taking place over the last month. Massive news has circulated this week with the continuation of the Facebook saga, the upcoming climate summit in Glasgow, Netflix's leaked financials, Nigeria's COVID vaccine wait, and the rise in oil prices. The S&P jumped 1.96%, closing at 4,471.37. The Dow Jones jumped up 570 points, or 1.64%. The Nasdaq jumped 357 points, or 2.46%. The financial sector had a successful week with the S&P 500 financial sector rising 1.51%. Goldman Sachs crushed analyst estimates on a strong investment banking and trading results. Goldman Sachs' profit at the bank surged 63% to $5.29 billion in the third quarter, as revenue climbed 26% to $13.61 billion. Goldman Sachs also saw investment banking revenue surge by 88% in the quarter to $3.7 billion. All of this led to the stock rising 3.8% on the day. Technology was also a sector that rose after taking a rough hit over the past month, with the S&P 500 information technology sector rising 0.79%. Tech giants Microsoft saw a 2.58% rise over the week, helping it climb back to almost up to its 52-week high. Apple had a slower week, rising 0.39%. Google rose 1.05%, and Facebook fell 0.59%. Industrials was another industry that rose over the past week, with the S&P 500 industrial sector up 0.96%. Utilities and communications both fell, but not in a major way that should scare investors. Facebook continues its saga, with Facebook whistleblower Frances Haugen, a former Facebook product manager. After testifying in front of Congress, she is now briefing the Australian MPs on the matter. Facebook continues to be labelled as harmful, bad for society, and big tobacco.
Explosive whistleblower testimony, a former Facebook product manager telling Senate lawmakers that Facebook knowingly harms its users. Here are some key moments from today's hearing.
I believe Facebook's products harm children, stoke division, and weaken our democracy. The company's leadership knows how to make Facebook and Instagram safer, but won't make the necessary changes because they have put their astronomical profits before people. Almost no one outside of Facebook knows what happens inside of Facebook. The company intentionally hides vital information from the public, from the US government, and from governments around the world. The algorithms are very smart in the sense that they latch on to things that people want to continue to engage with. And unfortunately, in the case of teen girls and things like self-harm, they develop these feedback cycles where children are using Instagram as to self-soothe, but then are exposed to more and more content that makes them hate themselves. The choices being made inside of Facebook are disastrous for our children, for our public safety, for our privacy, and for our democracy. While important, these will not get to the core of the issue, which is that no one truly understands the destructive choices made by Facebook except Facebook. We can afford nothing less than full transparency. As long as Facebook is operating in the shadows, hiding its research from public scrutiny, it is unaccountable. Until the incentives change, Facebook will not change.
World leaders are to meet in Glasgow for the climate summit, with the Queen even getting involved, saying it is really irritating when they talk but don't do. Some of the confirmed attendees are the Australian Prime Minister, the US President Joe Biden, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson, and the French President Emmanuel Macron. One major player that is missing, though, is the Chinese president.
I think, look, where we are in relation to the climate summit in Glasgow, we're not anywhere close to the finishing line in terms of the pledges that countries have made around the world, in terms of meeting the target set by scientists of halving emissions by 2030. So I think everybody's speaking out, and particularly somebody like the Queen that carries some weight around the world. This is tremendously important. And I think if you match that also with young people who are speaking out, I mean, not just famous young people like Greta, incredibly important, but I'm actually at a school climate assembly. 1,500 school children here with me talking about climate action, raising their voice. I mean, we need everybody's voice to be raised, but particularly those of young people. But the fact that the Queen is adding her voice from her generation, I think is absolutely brilliant news.
And it is, of course, highly unusual to get an insight into what the Queen is really thinking. She said it's really irritating when they talk, but they don't do. Who's she talking about?
Well, partly I think she's talking about everybody because, the Rio Earth Summit, when, all the world leaders pledged to take action on climate change, on the nature crisis and eradicate global poverty actually happened 30 years ago at the Rio Earth Summit. So basically, all the world leaders are culpable in terms of what they've done in the past 30 years. But of course, there is a big elephant in the room. There's no question about that. I mean, China is responsible for more than a quarter of the world's emissions. We can't make this target work unless China increases its ambitions. So I think there are a couple of countries of which China is probably the leader who really do need to step up to the plate and increase the level of ambition that is currently on the table.
And as it stands, China hasn't submitted its targets, and it's also expected that President Xi won't attend the COP26 summit. Without that, without China on board, what hopes are there of any real progress?
Look, obviously it's disappointing that some world leaders are not coming to Glasgow, and particularly President Xi from China, because they really do need to be in the room. They are very, very big players. But I think also what needs to happen at the Glasgow summit is that those countries that are in the room, and particularly the UK is going to be there, President Biden from the United States is going to be there, we need to prove that a just transition can work, that if we invest money in renewable energy, if we invest money in energy efficiency, if we, for example, can protect the world's rainforest by having a more plant-based diet and tackling the industrial meat industry, if we can prove that these things can work and deliver real change, positive change, that really benefits people, then I think we can be an example to the rest of the world to step up their ambition and start meeting the targets that scientists have set us.
No RSVP from China, but some progress. The Australian PM, Scott Morrison, has now said he is attending. But can we expect any real commitments from Australia?
Well, Scott Morrison has basically been shamed into attending, and it is really important that he does attend. I mean, Australia is the second largest coal exporter in the world after Indonesia. It's really critical that Australia gets off coal and invests heavily in renewable energy. I can't think of any country in the world that's got more renewable energy resources than Australia. And I think that we really need to turn the heat up on Scott Morrison, the Australian Prime Minister. He needs to come under real pressure from other world leaders, and particularly leaders from developing countries whose countries will be first at risk, and some of them, in the Pacific and the Indian Ocean will disappear if rich countries like Australia don't step up to the plate.
Netflix has also been under the light recently for firing an employee for sharing confidential financial information on the streamer's latest Dave Chappelle special. Nigeria currently waits on delivery for over 30 million COVID vaccines. That is affecting the whole economy. Nigeria has paid for these doses, but is yet to receive them. This is preventing the country from being able to fully open again and return to pre-pandemic ways. Nigeria's finance minister spoke on this topic.
Anybody we talk to today, particularly a finance minister, about their economy, we have to start with COVID and how it's affecting your economy. Where are you with your economy, and where are you with vaccinations?
Well, where we are with the economy is we need to be able to find vaccines to make sure that we're able to contain the pandemic. We're just lucky that the pandemic breakout has been quite low in Nigeria, with caseload of about 208,000 infected persons and loss of lives under 3,000. But we do need to vaccinate up to 70% of our population. As we speak, we're paid for vaccines, the supplies are not coming, the donations that have been committed to us are trickling in. We don't have up to about we have just up to about 4 million people vaccinated from a population of 211 million people. So it's a significant challenge for us. It's making it very difficult for us to plan. We have paid for 30 million vaccines under AVAT. The supplies are not coming, and it's really very disturbing.
Oil prices continue to rise higher and higher as prices of oil barrels hit $80. Oil barrels rose to 3-year highs on the back of supply deficit forecasts.
Take a look at oil prices this morning. Oil up right now to $80.89. Yesterday, its settlement was the highest we've seen in almost 7 years, so people have been watching as we continue to see these climbing prices. Joining us right now with his take on the growing energy crisis is Stephen Richardson. He's the head of oil and gas exploration and production research at Evercore ISI. And Stephen, you recently wrote a piece that was pretty interesting. You talked about the Goldilocks outlooks for U.S. crude. And it may be a Goldilocks outlook when it comes to crude oil prices, but it is not for anybody who uses oil at this point. Where do you think prices are headed?
Well, what we're experiencing is really a tightening of balances based on the, we had a pretty significant hurricane in August. And if you think about Ida, we lost quite a bit of infrastructure. And so what you're seeing is a tightening of balances based on that. And prices, crude imports have been very, very high, and domestic supply, as we referenced in that piece about a Goldilocks outlook, isn't really reacting in as quick a timeline as we would have expected in the past. And so I think that's what's propping up prices. And like I said, I mean, I do think that we could be in a period here of at least above mid-cycle prices for quite a bit. And as we're seeing on the screen, some upward momentum yet, because it's unclear where that incremental supply is going to come near term.
Near term, you're talking about higher prices. What are you thinking over the next couple of years?
Well, I mean, I think that what's really interesting is if you look out at the futures market, 2023, where we do think you're going to need to see some U.S. oil supply growth, that curve has come up quite a bit. It's come up to kind of the mid 60s, which is probably a price that starts to rebalance this market. We've got to remember that you've got OPEC Plus still has, quite a bit of spare capacity. They're going to be bringing, upwards of 1.5 million barrels to the market between now and year end or into 2022. And so I think that's the things to watch will be how that dynamic plays out. But, from a mid-cycle perspective, we still think the oil market can balance itself around 60.
Stephen, there has been a lot of debate about the ESG movement and what that has meant in terms of the big oil companies not spending as much on exploration as they have in the past, or as they had even planned to before you had activist investors get involved with some of this. There's a big debate about whether that is causing some of these high prices and making those high prices stickier or not. Where do you come down on it?
Well, where we come down on it is, there's no doubt that, that movement has quelled some of the appetite for long-dated investment. And that will ultimately have an impact, certainly as we're seeing in some geographies where you can't transition quickly enough to alternative power sources in electricity generation, for example. And so I think what what you're seeing is the market realizing that there will be some tightening before we can transition. The way we like to think about it is, the market wants the energy system that we're going to have in the future, but we're still stuck with our current energy system, and we still do need these hydrocarbons in the near term. I think in terms of investment, I think what's really interesting is in the U.S. at least, it is not, it's not just the ESG movement, but it is also, the desire for higher shareholder returns and the fact that a lot of the U.S. independents, which really drove U.S. supply growth for the last 10 years, are really on the sidelines, and they've made pretty significant commitments to return cash to shareholders. And so I think that's the other dynamic, beyond what you're reading about ESG and some of the reinvestment in alternative energy that's playing out here.
This is the first installment of Business Wrap-Up Weekly. This is a new weekly business, finance, and general news update video that will come out every week on a Saturday. Subscribe to Business Ventures and leave a comment or a like. That all supports the growth of the channel.